I'm really pleased to be joined today with Dr. Luis Felipe López-Calva from the World Bank. He's the Global Director for Poverty and Equity, World Bank Group. You can see from his bio when you registered that he has a distinguished record of service at both the World Bank and UNDP and indeed many other places, and academic as well. Um, I've known him in many other ways, so I thought I'd mention a couple of them here. First, as a graduate student at Cornell, when he was working on his dissertation, and I was writing a paper with his advisor, Kaushik Basu, who you may know as the former chief economist of the World Bank and also advisor in India. Um, Later on in Mexico, we actually go teaching a course at the University of Americas in Puebla, Mexico, which is actually Puebla, Mexico, is where Luis Felipe is from. And later on, as a co author on a paper that motivated the so called Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. So, this is an index that is presented by the UNDP in addition to the usual HDI to reflect the level of inequality within a country. So it's been wonderful just to have him right down the road, 5 minutes away at the World Bank, so he can join us occasionally for updates on what's happening in the world of international development. The formal portion of today's talk, as you could see, is entitled The World Bank Actions to End Poverty and a Livable Planet. And it will be followed by a short round of Q&A. Today's event has three separate origins. First, it is part of my GW class in development economics and will replace my own lecture on the World Bank. This follows a long tradition of bank folks coming over just across the road to help educate GW students. For example, in recent years, Inda Gill, the chief economist of the World Bank, has joined us on at least 3 separate occasions. It's great to have good neighbors. Second, this is the inaugural event for our new Yunus Initiative on extreme deprivation, of which I'm the inaugural director. Dr. Yunus has been a regular participant at events here in GW and was planning on being here since last fall, but has been understandably preoccupied by events in Bangladesh and his new role there. And so we are moving forward with this first of many events. The goal of the Yunus Initiative is to connect GW students and other colleagues to the ideas percolating around the work of Dr. Yunus, including new understandings of what it means to be deprived and novel solutions. For several years, GW students have traveled to Bangladesh as Grameen interns, learning firsthand about Grameen Bank. And one of our GW students, well, actually, there's one here right now, I think. April, you're going, right? And another of our GW students, Ethan Carr, has been working with me to try and figure out, to brainstorm sort of the activities for the coming year. Thank you, Director Remy Jedwab and the staff of the Institute for your support. All right, I'm done talking now. So let's turn over the podium to our speaker, Luis Felipe López-Calva.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you to George Washington University for the invitation to the IAE. And it's really an honor to be in the inauguration of this Yunus initiative. That's one of the reasons why I will actually use some of Yunus's quotes during my presentation to see how well aligned what I will be presenting is with the thinking of Dr. Yunus, whom, by the way, I have been following recently because of the responsibility in Bangladesh. And you can read the speech he gave during the 100th day of the transition government. It's a fantastic speech, so I encourage you to see that. Thank you, James, also for the very generous introduction. And I thought you were going to talk about the day that we ran out of gas on our way to Acapulco. But that would have been very embarrassing because it was lack of judgment in my part. But we have been friends and collaborators for a long time, so it's great to be here. So what I will present today is based on, it's a bit of an elaboration of how we interpret the new mission of the World Bank that was approved 3 years ago. That is, in short, is what we call ending poverty on a livable planet. Very important for you, as I will present here, that to understand that livable planet, of course, refers to issues related to climate, but not only. Livable planet has a broader definition and relates also to fragility and conflict. It relates to pandemics. It relates to many other global challenges that are embedded in that concept of the livable planet. So let me start with some trends. Just very briefly, I will start actually with a quote. How can I? We share the main objective, right? That the idea is precisely to live in a world free of poverty, and the idea is that this requires, as I will develop in the presentation, systemic changes. This is about how we address the issue of poverty systemically. So the first thing that is important to say is that the world has achieved a lot in the recent decades, even though then eventually after 2015, the progress slowed down and eventually had a reversal during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. But more than 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty in the last decade. So this is something that we have to also to acknowledge. Not all is bad news. And this is mainly driven by large countries in Asia, for example, China, and more recently, as we will see soon, India. But still, the challenge is huge. If we take in the World Bank, after the Atkinson Commission gave the recommendations, we have different poverty lines, and I will show in a minute how we estimate those poverty lines. But if we take the highest poverty line, monetary poverty line, which is the one for upper middle income countries, this is established at $6.85 per person per day in purchasing power parity adjusted values. Close to 40% of the global population is poor. And that is not a very high standard. So that means that still the challenge that we have to end poverty from a monetary perspective is huge. And certainly, if we go at the, first, maybe I will show this. The way we estimate the poverty lines is important for you to know. This is not something that the bank imposes on countries. We take the poverty lines that the countries themselves produce, and we group countries by income level. And then for each group, we take the median of the distribution of poverty lines. And that median value is what we consider the poverty line for that specific group. So for low income countries, it's $2.15. For lower middle income is $3.65. For upper middle income is $6.85. And for high income countries, it's close to $25 per person per day. That's the way we do it, but this will be updated very soon. In June, we are updating the PPP values, the purchasing power parity values, but also we are updating the poverty lines themselves. Okay, we will have the numbers by then after they are go through all the quality control. But I can tell you that the number is going to be around one person in every 10, so about 10% level of global poverty, which is a very high level of poverty still, particularly if we think ahead in terms of the SDG number 1, which is ending poverty. So we're not going to achieve that goal almost certainly. The reasons, well, slowdown in economic growth. Of course, the impacts of the pandemic that we saw the largest increase in poverty since World War II. Concentration of the poor in very complicated settings. I will also mention that more of this in a minute, and increased levels of conflict and fragility in the world. If we project the poverty lines until the most recent year, which is 2024, we see that every income group of countries has overcome the impact of the pandemic, except for low-income countries. So for low-income countries, the level of poverty today is still higher than the one pre-pandemic. Okay, so in a way that we can speak of a more permanent shock in terms of monetary poverty for those low-income countries. The regional composition has changed, and we can confidently say that more and more extreme poverty globally is becoming an African, and particularly sub-Saharan African issue. There has been a very rapid reduction in India because of the process of growth, which means basically that most of the poor will be concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of them in what we call IDA. As you know, IDA is the International Development Association, which is the instrument that the global community created to support the poorest people in the world. So the countries that qualify, more than 70 countries that qualify for IDA support, are the ones that contain the largest number of poor globally and fragile and conflict-affected states. That poses a more difficult challenge, because creating good policies to lift the poor out of their condition in those settings becomes even more difficult because of the institutional weakness. Finally, if we just rely on growth, it will take us a very long time to end poverty. So we need to be concerned also about having a growth process that is more inclusive, which means basically that growth is particularly focused on those that are at the bottom of the income distribution in order to move faster in terms of poverty reduction. So this is like the first set of facts, but also we know, and I cannot not talk about multidimensional poverty in this setting, because as I was recently, actually last week in Chile, presenting the Latin American Multidimensional Poverty Index published by ECLAC and UNDP. And I really think that there is an intellectual victory. When this was published first in 2010, well, this is, of course, the original paper with the technology or the methodology to aggregate the Multidimensional Poverty Index by Sabina and James. That had huge impact and led to the publication of the first global multidimensional poverty index in 2010 by UNDP, and it created a lot of controversy, including in the institution where I proudly represent. But the fact that now 2 years ago we decided to incorporate the Multidimensional Poverty Index published by OFI, and by UNDP in our World Development Indicators, I really consider that an intellectual victory of this line of thinking. So now it will be very difficult not to understand poverty in its multidimensionality, right? So we always talk about monetary poverty, but we also know that poverty is multidimensional. If we look at the latest OFI UNDP MPI, it's about 1.1 billion people living in multidimensional poverty. We take the monetary line, it's about 700 million people that are monetary poor. So the multidimensional poverty tends to be higher, and we take the World Bank multidimensional poverty indicator, which is much more, I would say, much simpler, more reduced in terms of the dimensions, and one that also incorporates monetary poverty at one dimension, which is a huge difference compared to the other one. The indicator is about 13.4% of the global population. Okay? So this is sort of the state of poverty, global poverty, based on our mandate we have in the bank to monitor precisely how poverty evolves. One question that I always ask is, so we understand and measure poverty multidimensionally, but this is just like a brief detour. My question always is, so how we change the way we do policy? Because then we measure poverty multidimensionally, but we still go back and think in sector by sector, but we don't think about poverty really multidimensionally. when we address the policy discussion. So I'll give you two examples in which we are trying to use a multidimensionality more proactively in policy. One is to use it to approximate chronicity when we don't have panel data. So chronic poverty is about people who have been poor in different periods of time, but we cannot follow the same people because it's very expensive and not all countries have panel data. So what we did in Brazil first, and now we do it in many other countries, is to have this matrix where we have monetary poverty on one axis and multidimensional poverty in the other axis, and we divide the population in these four groups, and those that are both monetary poor and multidimensionally poor are more likely to be chronic poor. And we actually tested that in the paper that I cite here. We tested that in 3 countries in which we actually have panel data, and we see that the probability of those people that are both multidimensionally and monetary poor, the probability that they are chronic poor is actually substantially higher compared to the other groups. And this is important because the policies to address chronic poor versus transient poor, the policies are very different. Okay, so this is one example. This is just a matrix of how we did this for Brazil, and you can see what is share of the population is in each status. Okay. One more experimental way that we are looking at is this using complexity. Why? With dimensional poverty, if you look at all the dimensions and the variables before you aggregate, what you have is a vector of state variables of a system in which each dimension has its own dynamics, but also they interact, right? So it's a complex system. So we use economic complexity or network analysis, and we define these two concepts. One is called the poverty space, very similar to the use of complexity for other purposes in economics. And then the poverty centrality, which means poverty centrality is what is that dimension that has the largest impact on the system as a whole, okay? And then we apply that to 67 countries. So think of this, and that's why we call it development as acupuncture. Because if we find a node that has the impact, the largest impact on the system, we can be more effective, right? So where do you invest the marginal dollar? So in a way, you put it in one place, and it has impact in the other variables, right? So one that is interesting is housing conditions, for example. Housing conditions seems to have a largest impact on others because it affects health, it affects attendance, education, but through other dimensions has an impact in the whole system. So that is something that we have found empirically. There is no theory really behind this. It's really purely empirical. But again, this is very experimental. I just wanted to mention that we are trying to use this multidimensionality in a more, more proactive way to understand policy. If you go to this QR, you are going to find this analysis for 67 countries that we are using. Soon, and by the way, on May 5th, we have a complexity day. We are all invited at the World Bank, where we will have for the whole day, we are going to be presenting different applications of complexity analysis, trade to environment, and we will present the analysis applied to poverty. Okay. So up to this point is you saw more or less a picture of where we are in terms of global poverty, okay? If you want to ask for clarifications or so, please feel free to do so, okay? So next thing is now we need to address this through our policy. As I said, our original mission was ending poverty. Now it's ending poverty on a livable planet. So originally, if you enter the World Bank, you would see this. Now, if you enter the World Bank, you see this, okay? But there was a lot of work that led from one to the other, consultations and so on, which I try to illustrate by this. This is the person who was actually changing the message at the entrance of the World Bank. It doesn't look that happy, but we were happy to actually move in that direction. But when we talk also about Livable Planet, and this is something that we can maybe discuss further, but we are in unprecedented levels of high uncertainty, right? So you are now, you have to address this issue of poverty reduction in a context in which uncertainty is very high. This is the uncertainty index used by the IMF, also cited by UNDP. And by the way, this is not updated. I'm sure today this is much higher. I would confidently argue that today is much higher. This is until April 4th. Some aspects of that, as we say, we tend to say the future is not what it used to be. Why? Because you used to have an idea of what were the possible scenarios. Now even that has become more difficult to predict. So shocks are becoming more frequent. For example, extreme weather events are more frequent, and these are tend to have a permanent impact. So a short-term impact in a crisis tends to have a long time to recover, and then there's another crisis or another shock. So people who are, as we call it, in the extensive margin of risk are permanently affected, and it's very difficult to recover from that, right? So as a complement to our multidimensional poverty and monetary poverty indicators, we added now in our reporting to the board this indicator of vulnerability. So let me explain to you how we go about vulnerability. We basically do it in this way. We have four different definitions of, four different types of shocks, climate-related shocks. And we map, literally, geographically, we map the people who are exposed to these type of shocks. Okay, so the first dimension that we have is exposure to those shocks. But then we correct by some people actually have, or households have the capacity to cope with the shock because they are connected to financial markets, because they have social protection mechanisms, because they have better assets or more education or so. So we use a multidimensional poverty index, and we overlap that with exposure. So the multidimensional index has access to water, electricity, connectivity to markets, and then variable of income, social protection, financial instruments, and education. So this multidimensional index, in a way, is telling us how prepared people are to cope with the shock. Okay, we overlap these two, and we come up with actually the people who are at risk, or as we call them, vulnerable. Okay, who fall back into poverty because of the shock. So look at this. These are the regions in the world. This is the total population in each region. The first dimension, as I said, or the first layer, is exposure. So this blue space is what you see, blue circle, is the people who are exposed to the shock. Now we overlap with the capacity to cope, and we end up with this red circle. Okay. So compare, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia with North America. By the way, I always clarify because I'm Mexican, and Mexico is North America, but this is North America without Mexico. Okay. Okay. So, but look at the comparison, and you can see that in North America without Mexico, you have a lot of people exposed, but relatively few people at risk because the capacity to cope is much better. Okay? Whereas if you go to Sub-Saharan Africa, you practically cannot differentiate the blue from the red, right? So everybody who is exposed is also vulnerable or at risk. So we need, if we go back to this, we know where do we have to invest to reduce the vulnerability, okay? So this is a new indicator that we are presenting in our global reports and corporate scorecards. If we group countries here, as you see, by those who are the poorest, which we label as IDA, so they qualify for IDA engagement in the bank. The bank has these two types of instruments. One is the IDA, which is concessional, and then the other is the IBRD, which is the one that has different conditions in terms of the lending. So IDA are for the poorest countries. So you can see here that the population at risk in the poorest countries increased, while in the other countries actually reduced, went down, okay? So it's a huge challenge there. Finally, one indicator that we also have in our reporting is inequality. For the first time, the mission statement of the bank explicitly talks about inequality. We used to, we have this concept of shared prosperity that 10 years ago was the compromise between those who, I included, myself included, and Koshik included, who wanted to bring inequality more prominently into the discussion. But there was, a part of the bank that said, no, it's not, and with good reasons, like saying, well, we don't know what the optimal level of inequality is, these kind of things, or it depends how inequality is generated. There is inequality that comes from productivity enhancing dynamics and so on. So basically, we ended up with shared prosperity. Now we have explicitly inequality, okay? And what the mission says is fighting poverty and inequality. And the statement in the corporate scorecard is we have to support the reduction of countries with high inequality. We have to reduce the number of countries with high inequality, and high inequality is defined, the threshold is a Gini coefficient of 0.4, okay? And this is taken from the SDG reporting by the UN that defines also high inequality as a Gini higher than 0.4. Of course, this is debatable, and we can change that threshold, but that is the one that we chose for these reports. Okay, if we look at that level of, that threshold, most of the countries with high inequality are concentrated in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, I have 10 minutes left. So this is the issue with inequality. The number of countries with high inequality has gone down, but many of them are just there in the threshold, right? And some people would argue, I think, credibly, that part of the problem why this number of countries is going down is because the way we measure the upper tail in the household surveys is not very, very good. So we see, for example, recently I was in India, we were talking to the statistics office, in gated communities, in buildings, in certain types of constructions that are associated with higher income people, it is more difficult to actually get a full response to the survey. So basically, we're not necessarily measuring inequality as well as we could. And basically, the message here is that inequality mediates the relation between growth and poverty reduction. So the same level of, look at this for Africa, look at the elasticity here for Sub-Saharan Africa. So for 1 point of growth in Sub-Saharan Africa, the impact on poverty is lower than in other regions. One of the reasons we argue is because of the high inequality. Not the only one, but one of them, right? So, so inequality matters in the interaction between growth and poverty reduction, okay? So what should we do if we have all this uncertainty, all this complexity to try to enhance our capacity to eliminate poverty? Well, we call it these 3 pillars, right? Grow, invest, and ensure. So you have to grow, but you have to invest in the capacity of the poorest to generate their own income. And we have to protect them once they leave the condition of poverty so they don't go back. But that's the uncertain, the vulnerability part of the story, right? So this grow, invest, and ensure. When we say grow and invest, is basically about assets. And we have defined these 5 types of assets, and we need to support those at the bottom of the distribution to accumulate and use these assets more intensively, and they get the proper returns. And by the way, let me give you just one example. Access to electricity. You see how the number of people without access to electricity goes down in Central and Southern Asia, and look at Africa, right? Mm. So that's why one of the commitments that President Banga announced in the last annual meetings is what we call Mission 300. And he said in 5 years, the World Bank is committed to bringing electricity to 300 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa. Very concrete commitment, okay? And we are all working to achieve that goal, okay? So this is one example. Now, the other example is inclusion in terms of finance. And I'm gonna summarize this in a minute, but the idea is finance is really important. And, in a Yunus initiative, we have to talk about this because of the importance it has. But not only financial inclusion, but financial intermediation. Look at this data for Guatemala. 37% of the people say, I have a bank account, but only 11% use it to borrow, and only 10% use it to save. So they basically have it as a means to receive remittances or to receive a transfer from government. They withdraw the money, that's it. There is no financial intermediation. What there is basically just that they have the bank account, but they don't actually use it to try to increase their productive capacity, okay? So that's an important issue. And then, of course, digital. One of the initiatives of President Banga in the World Bank was creating a new vice presidency only for digital. We need to digitalize countries. And let me show you these. The three conditions for digital are investing in infrastructure, investing in skills, and looking at the regulations so that the productivity gains are widespread and not only concentrated in a few, right? So, because if you don't look at the regulation, you can actually have highly concentrated markets so that digitalization becomes another way of exclusion in terms of a way to include those who most need it. So the key point here is that we have to understand growth and distribution as jointly determined, and not to think about growth and then separately we think about distribution. Why? Because the growth we see comes from the different capacity of groups in the population to be part of that process of growth. So what we care about is about growth incidence. These are growth incidence curves, right? We care about the level of growth, but we care about the shape. These are the poorest, and these are the least poor, right? So this is people are ordered by income. So you want to see higher growth at the bottom. So you care about the level, but you care about the slope. You would like to see a slope that is more negative, so that those at the bottom are growing faster. That dynamically reduces inequality, right? So this is what you would like to see. So as I tell always our teams, our global team, all our poverty, as we call them in the bank, we're our poverty economists in the bank, 240 people that work in 7 regions, which constitutes the global practice for poverty. I tell them we are the microeconomists of growth incidence. We are not there to measure poverty. We are there to change the pattern of growth through the policies that we recommend, right? We need to care more about the assets and more about the stocks and less about the flows. Of course, the flows, but as a result of thinking about the assets, human capital, physical, financial, social, natural capital. So if we think more about stocks and less about flows, we are going to be having a more permanent impact on these growth incidents, okay? And then ensure that can be done, of course, through markets, but also through fiscal systems. This is a comparison that we have, the 2 dots that you see for each country is the poverty level before the COVID pandemic. Sorry, during the COVID pandemic, the first dot is before the fiscal transfers were activated, and the second dot is after the fiscal transfers were activated. And you can see that in every country, poverty went down. I mean, the impact of the COVID pandemic was less dramatic thanks to the fiscal redistribution that took place. But also you see that much more effective in high-income countries versus low-income countries. Why? Because there is more informality, because there is less administrative capacity, there is less fiscal capacity. So even though in all cases the response was good for poverty reduction, was much less effective in low-income countries. And finally, how to integrate, and this comes from the thinking of Santiago Levy and others, is how we integrate fiscal system and social policies that do not generate informality and so on, but are actually fiscally sustainable, but also growth friendly, right? If we create wrong incentives through fiscal policy or through social policy, we can be actually hurting the growth capacity. And again, as I was saying before the talk to a few of you, the impact, the emphasis that President Banga has brought in the bank, that we have to more proactively think about jobs, more and better jobs, job quality, as we were saying with James. We care about creating more jobs, but also creating better jobs. Okay, and this is the emphasis of the spring meetings in 2 weeks. It's going to be precisely in terms of jobs. If we take the job quality index produced by the bank in the LAC region, we see that after the pandemic, the number of jobs was recovered, but we ended up with lower quality jobs. Okay, so in terms of quality, the impact was more permanent. Okay, let me. And by the way, I wanted to also cite this by Dr. Yunus, precisely because the idea is very much aligned with the idea of the assets and how the ability of people to generate their own income. So I find that very consistent with the approach that we are following. And I always use this example. Think of the economy as a body. So the backbone are the institutions, but then you have the circulatory system. It's energy, digital, and finance. Without these three, so these three are the ones that allow ideas and resources to flow around, right? If those systems are clogged, then nothing is going to happen. I mean, this system is going to die, right? It cannot actually produce. And for that, again, the institutions, and this comes from the WDR in the policy arena, as we call it, is the place where policies are defined. And those policies have an impact, which is growth incidence, as I said. So we have to be working with this policy arena, which is what we do when we talk to countries about how to design policies, so that we have a growth incidence that is more of the shape that I mentioned before, right? Because if we don't do that, the way you grow, the pattern of growth, redistributes influence in that policy arena. So the first part of the cycle is you define certain policies that have, suppose you are concentrating income at the top. Those people that are getting more benefits from growth are going to have more power to influence the policy, right? So basically, you end up with this cycle of distorted policies. But also in that policy arena, you can change the rules. And we can think of recent examples in which this is happening. You can actually change the rules, and that redistributes the jure power. So you make the system more permanently biased or not against a certain type of economic growth, right? So the power asymmetries that we mentioned in the World Development Report 2017 are manifested in that policy arena. And this is where we have to act. And I will close with an example of how we can influence that policy arena. So when we were doing this report, we always used to say that for economists, when you talk about power, people can only think of electricity. Because power is not really a category in the development discussion. So what we wanted to do in this report is to bring power, or the microeconomics, or the micro foundations of how power affects policy, as a way to bring it into the core of how we discuss the policy effectiveness that we see. So why are the good policies not implemented or not designed? Because of those power asymmetries. So the same way that we talk about information asymmetries, we have to think about how some people have more influence than others in that policy arena, right? So you have to think about the rules, about the policies, but also about the actors. And this is what we analyze in that infinity loop in the WDR. I close with this because I was asked also to talk about what is the role of the international organizations, right? So we have in the report, we divide the actors in three. So we basically have elite. By the way, elites is not a normative way of calling a group. Elites are those who are closer to the decision making. That's all. It's a descriptive. It's a descriptive label. Then you have citizens, which are the ones that can basically influence only through voting or through through some type of political participation. And of course, you have international actors, right? By the main point in the report is that sustainable change can only be brought about by agreements between elites and citizens. It's very little what international actors can do. Cannot import institutional change. It has to be coming from agreements among the local actors, right? And there are many examples that we give in the report of how elite bargains. By the way, there is a book by Stefan Derkon, a recent book called precisely, the title is about elite bargains, right? The idea how elites can be pro-development or can be anti-development in a way. There are many examples where elites, those who are close to the decision-making process, it can bring about very good things in terms of development long term. And sometimes Frank Fukuyama says that always there is an alliance between part of the elites and citizens that is behind positive change. When he talks about what he calls transitions to the rule of law. So, as international actors, how can we influence those agreements among the domestic actors? Okay, so one that people tend to think more in a simple way is that international actors are part of that policy arena. I would argue that this is not typically the case. There are many cases where we can provide advice and so on, but we're not really part of that policy arena because we are not in Congress, we are not in the executive. These are really the actors that play that role. However, because when people say, very simple to say, well, this is the IMF and the World Bank are to be blamed for this because because we only provide certain type of advice, technical assistance. We are not the ones making the decisions. However, international actors can provide alternative ways of contestation. So, human rights councils, International Court of Justice, arbitration mechanisms, that we can provide. And then local actors can rely on those mechanisms to rebalance the power asymmetry locally, right? So that's one way in which you can influence. Another way in which you can influence is by providing resources, loans, grants, IDA, IBRD, and that allows the local actors to do things with those resources. So that's the other way in which we can influence, but also we can shift the preferences or shape in a way through knowledge, through technical assistance, through the exchange of good practices in other places of the world, right? So one thing that we try to do is to do that in a competitively neutral way, to enhance the quality of the public deliberation by bringing knowledge and data and so on, not only to the government, but to everybody in society, so they can have a better dialogue in terms of more informed dialogue in terms of specific policies. So again, these are all some of the mechanisms that we have as international actors to try to help the reshaping of that policy arena. But again, we are not actors inside the policy arena, but we can influence. And the way we try to do it, and with this now I close, is by understanding the balance and trying to reshape that balance in a way that is development enhancing, right? So we try to do it in a way in which whatever is agreed at the end is good for society. But again, it's just indirect influence that the international actors can have. At the end, the sustainable change can only come from new agreements among the domestic actors, right? So I will leave it there. Hopefully enough food for thought for the conversation.